In many studies of human interaction to stress, it was found that adaptation occurs as a result of coping processes. We all have thoughts, feelings, impulses, and memories that can be difficult to deal with. In some cases, people deal with difficult feelings by utilizing what they are known as defense mechanisms. The defense mechanism is a process for adaptation. These defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological responses that protect people from feeling of anxiety, threats to self-esteem, and things that they don't want to think about or deal with. In this lesson, we will examine Freud's defense mechanism and how they work. We will explore a list of most common defense mechanisms with definitions and real-life examples. So today we are going to talk about Freudian defense mechanisms, and this is basically what Freud thought that you do when you are faced with stress. And he thought that stress and anxiety are basically caused by your three parts of your personality fighting with each other. He thought that there are basically an id, an ego, and a superego. And that your id has a lot of impulses and things it wants to do. It's kind of childish. It doesn't really have self-control. Your superego is all self-control. So it's always limiting what the id wants to do. And your ego is the conscious part of you that has to deal with this conflict. And what Freud thought is when this anxiety gets out of hand, your ego starts to feel like it's under attack. And so it tries to do one of these defense mechanisms to protect itself from having to deal with too much stress. It is important to know that these are actually unconscious, so this different than coping strategy, which is something you decide to do to deal with stress. A defense mechanism is something that you are doing without really thinking about it to manage the conflict between your three parts of your personality. In order to deal with anxiety, Freud believed that defense mechanisms helped protect ego from the conflicts created by the id, superego, and reality. So what happens when the ego cannot deal with the demands of our desire, the constraints of reality, and our own moral standards? According to Freud, anxiety is an unpleasant inner state that people seek to avoid. Anxiety acts as a signal to the ego that things are not going the way they should. As a result, the ego then employs some sort of defense mechanisms to help reduce these feelings of anxiety. Although we may consciously use these mechanisms in many cases, these defenses work unconsciously to distort reality. The greatest problems arise when defense mechanisms are overused in order to avoid dealing with problems. While all defense mechanisms can be unhealthy, they can also be adaptive and allow us to function normally. Let's look at each of the main types of defense mechanisms and the coping strategies. Some you will notice are healthier than the others. Most people rely on 2 or 3, but we all do most of these at least sometimes. First, denial. Many people use denial in their everyday lives to avoid dealing with painful feelings or areas of their life they don't wish to admit. Something happens to you and you're saying that it doesn't. It just didn't happen. For example, if you failed a math test and you're really upset about it, this is maybe creating a conflict with your sense of self as being good at math. If you just told people that you did fine, that you didn't fail, that would be a real refusal to accept reality, and that is denial. And it's unhealthy because you are totally disconnecting yourself with what actually happened. You're not interacting with reality if you use this defense mechanism, and that can lead to some serious problems. In many cases, there might be overwhelming evidence that something is true, yet the person will continue to deny its existence or truth because it is too uncomfortable to face. People living with drugs or alcohol addiction often deny that they have a problem. Denial functions to protect the ego from things with which the individual cannot cope. Another one, passive aggression. This is not the original one of Freud's defense mechanism. It was added later. For example, you're upset with your roommate. Let's say you made a cake and she ate it. So you might forget to pick her up from her work like you promised, but you really didn't forget it. You just didn't want to do it. This is bad because you are expressing anger, but you're not doing it in a way that's tied to anything that she can understand. You're not really dealing with the situation. You're just acting out. It is an indirect way of expressing anger. The next mechanism is repression. Repression is unconscious defense mechanism that is employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. Thoughts that are often repressed are those that would result in feelings of guilt from the superego. This is not a very successful defense in the long term, since it involves forcing disturbing wishes, ideas, or memories into the unconscious where it is hidden. They will create anxiety. Repressed memory may appear to subconscious means and altered forms such as dreams or slips of the tongue. Projection. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism that involves taking our own unacceptable feelings or thoughts that would cause guilt onto another. In another word, putting an unpleasant thoughts onto somebody else. For example, accusing your boyfriend of being interested in his new classmate, when in reality it's you who have an eye on someone else, and this guilt or thought is projected onto another to reduce anxiety. Displacement. Let's look at the example of displacement. A good example of this defense mechanism is getting angry at your parents or your close friends because you had a bad day at school. Neither of these people is the target of your strong emotions, but reacting to them is likely less problematic than reacting to your teacher. That is replacement. You are displacing the anger you feel onto someone else. It helps you to deal with the anger, but it's not really that productive. The next one is regression. This type of defense mechanism may be most obvious in young children. If they experience trauma or loss, they may suddenly act as if they are younger again. Adults who are struggling to cope with events or behaviors may overeat foods that make them feel comfortable. They may also avoid everyday activities because they feel overwhelming. Regression functions as a form of retreat. It allows a person to psychologically go back in the time to a period when the person felt safer. When we are troubled or frightened, our behaviors often become more childish. For example, a child may begin to suck their thumb again or wet their bed when they need to spend some time in the hospital. Teenagers may giggle uncontrollably when introduced into a social situation involving the opposite sex. The next one is sublimation. Sublimation is similar to displacement, but takes place when we manage to displace our unacceptable emotions into behaviors which are constructive and socially acceptable rather than destructive activities. Sublimation is a defense mechanism that allows us to act out unacceptable impulses by converting these behaviors into a more acceptable form. For example, a person experiencing extreme anger might take up a kickboxing classes as the means of expressing the frustration. Many great artists and musicians have had unhappy lives and have used the medium of arts, of music to express themselves. Sport is another example of putting our emotions, for example, aggression, into something constructive. Freud believed that sublimation was a sign of maturity that allows people to function normally in socially acceptable ways. The next mechanism is rationalization. Rationalization is a defense mechanism that involves explaining an unacceptable behavior or feeling in a rational or logical manner. A person tries to avoid the true reasons for the behavior. For example, a person who is turned out for a date might rationalize the situation by saying they were not attracted to the other person anyway. A student might blame a poor exam score on the instructor or the teacher rather than their own lack of preparation. And another defense mechanism is intellectualization. This defense mechanism allows us to avoid thinking about the stressful, emotional aspect of the situation and try to focus only on the intellectual components instead. For example, a person who had just been diagnosed with cancer might focus on learning everything about the disease in order to avoid distress or remain distant from the reality of the situation. And the last mechanism is humor. For example, you lose your jobs and then you joke about it with your friends. That's a way of expressing bad feelings, but in a way that's easier to deal with. You're not denying it, but you're expressing it in a healthy way. You use a method of pointing out the funny or ironic aspect of the situation. So that's basically an overview of a lot of defense mechanisms. You're it. Your ego and your superego fighting with each other, and that causes stress. And you use these mechanisms, these unconscious ways to deal with that stress in varying effectiveness. Defense mechanisms are ways that people manage difficult emotions, which often involves with unconscious distortions of reality to make things easier to swallow. While defense mechanisms are often thought of as negative reactions, we all need them to temporarily ease stress and protect self-esteem during critical times. Using defense mechanism can be either healthy or unhealthy, depending on the context and how we use them.